Here we go. If you do not want to appear on the recording, all you have to do is turn off your camera and it won't show your name or anything. But you can still ask us questions. Later as we go in the program, you can put your questions in the chat if you'd rather, if that makes you feel more comfortable. But I think that we have a small enough group tonight that later, hopefully, you can unmute yourself and we can let you ask your questions yourself. So without further ado, maybe a good question, Pat, is we can just ask what inspired these guys to write this book. Maybe that's a good place to start.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Great. Well, first of all, Ryan and I are so honored to be here. So thank you to you all for organizing this and to everyone that's joined us. We're just grateful. And the technical answer to your question is that this is a book that began for us about 3 years ago. But in some ways, it's a book about a decade and a half in the making. And I say that because if we wind back the clock to 2006, 2007, that was a time that we found ourselves questioning what it is that was happening in classrooms, in our libraries, in our museums, because we were hearing something from educators who themselves had maybe been in the classroom 1 year, some cases 30 years, were in and out of school, were in urban and rural locations, and they were saying this: I'm not connecting with kids the way that I used to. Now, on one hand, that seems totally normal, right? Generations of adults have probably at some point gone, kids these days. And yet, as we began to notice these caring adults saying this, we began to appreciate that they literally meant my class in 2005 versus my class in 2006. And it feels naive to say this in 2021, but back then we didn't really know the learning sciences very well. And fast forward 15 years, we've learned tremendously about the learning sciences, what we're learning about learning itself. And 15 years ago, it was the case that seismic changes were happening in kids' lives, and they were developing their identities differently, seeking affirmation differently, consuming and producing information differently. And in fact, we're growing up differently, driven by societal and technological changes. And living here in Pittsburgh and having the opportunity to work here in Pittsburgh as we do, Fred Rogers is a storyline. And for a decade and a half, we've talked a lot about Fred Rogers in the context of learning in and out of schools. But it was really just 3 years ago when we began to appreciate Fred Rogers, not just as that loving, caring individual on our television screen, not just as someone who's dedicated to whole child development theory and practice, but as a learning scientist, and really seeing Fred Rogers as a learning scientist and understanding that what was happening in our schools and other places where we all have the privilege of being or supporting kids, that in fact something different was happening, and we could see it through this lens of Fred Rogers as a learning scientist.
It was, first of all, I just want to echo Greg's appreciation. Thank you so much for having us. I see a few very familiar faces. I really appreciate you all being here. It was interesting when we started to research the book, when we started to get this sort of nebulous idea about a book about Fred Rogers. As we were looking into the learning sciences, we realized that scientists were saying things that to us sounded very unscientific. So if you talk to some of the top researchers, psychologists, educators, folks who are studying what it is we know about how children and human beings learn, if you read their latest papers, if you go to their conferences, they're talking about things like making sure kids feel safe. They're talking about making sure kids feel loved, making sure kids feel heard. These things, they don't necessarily sound scientific. We're not talking in terms of data. We're not talking in terms of numbers. We're talking in terms of these very human competencies that sound less like something out of a science lab and more like a script from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Sorry, I muted myself. I completely agree. It's very interesting. And I finished your book just a couple of days ago, and I liked how you organized it into those three basic, very important overarching principles. I thought that was really a great way to go at this issue. So one of the questions that one of our attendees submitted is, what story or memory of Mr. Rogers that you learned during the writing of this book do you think was the most profound? Is that a tough place to start?
No, I mean, it's a great place to start, but it's not an easy question because there are so many instances. One of the great pleasures of doing this project was revisiting the neighborhood as an adult. And I think for both Greg and I, who grew up watching Mr. Rogers, we're both children of Western Pennsylvania. The specifics of what he had done faded over time, and what was left over was this sort of aura of Mr. Rogers is a nice, kind old man in a sweater, and he makes you feel good. And of course, he is that. But it was one of the most fascinating things for us was going back and just seeing the rigor of his methods. Everything he did, every scene, every frame of more than 900 episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you can pick out. And when you understand the learning science behind it, you can see exactly what he's doing. His sweaters, when he came onto the set, were a device. It was a way of conveying warmth to children. The music, if you're familiar with the tune, it starts with this very fast, frenetic piano melody that slows down as Rogers comes in the room, helping kids feel safe and ready to learn. Even the camera pans from left to right, which is the way children learn to read. There was a method, there was an intention behind everything that is it's fascinating to watch as an adult, and it just revealed how far ahead of his time he was. That's a very technical answer because I needed a minute to think about what was most moving, because there were a lot. Greg, I don't know if something came to mind.
So my answer is more emotional then. So, because having grown up in Pittsburgh, I lived in Fred Rogers' neighborhood, right? And as kids, there would be occasions you would see Fred Rogers. And as an adult, just a few years before he passed, I had the complete privilege of meeting him. And it's this sort of thing where as an adult you melt and you're like, oh my God, it's Fred Rogers, right? It's sort of an embarrassing moment, but it was just such a privilege to meet a childhood hero. And Ryan and I can speak to this later. We then got the privilege of really getting to know Joanne, Mrs. Rogers, in a really special way. I would say when I think about profound stories about Fred Rogers, it's the stories that Ryan and I heard in the course of interviewing, but it's really the stories we're starting to hear now, right? Having had the book released and so many people approach us or email us or contact us and say like, oh my gosh, I met Mr. Rogers in the elevator. Oh, I met Mr. Rogers at the bakery. He was buying chocolate chip cookies, right? And it's just these personal moments that people have that clearly are part of their core memories. And it's a reminder that Fred Rogers was exactly who he was. He was exactly who we would all have wanted him to be. He really was a special human being. Now, as Joanne Rogers said, he was no saint. So we don't want to beatify him here, but he was a genuine person, and he was that genuine person on his show, which is why he described his program as a visit, as if what you all and I are doing right now was made very personal. And that's how he conducted himself. And so I think the most profound stories are the very personal stories we're hearing from people who, like us and like you, were touched by it.
One of my favorite examples of this sort that Greg just mentioned, we heard it was an event, I think last week. Everybody, if you watch Mr. Rogers growing up, almost everybody remembers one specific episode, and it's the visit to the Crayon Factory. It seems to be just about everybody's favorite. And Fred, of course, was very aware of this, and people would come up to him and say, oh, I just love that episode where you took us to the Crayon Factory. And he would always ask, well, what was your favorite color crayon as a child? And, somebody would mention yellow or blue offhand. And more often than not, months later, they would get a yellow or a blue crayon in the mail from Fred Rogers. As an adult, these are people who just crossed paths with him at a fundraiser, in a bakery, in an elevator. These little moments that they matter to people, and I think Rogers recognized that in a way that continues to move people even today.
I don't remember a specific episode when I was a kid, but I remember lots of little images from them. And, you know, reading the anecdotes in your book, it was, I think what kind of surprised me is just how many really difficult issues he would tackle in these shows. And they kind of, I don't know if they just entered into my consciousness when I was a child watching the
Right.
show and I just didn't really register. But I was kind of shocked reading him now as, you know, as a parent of grown children and, you know, looking back on them. It was really surprising how some of those issues were really pretty tense and pretty intense.
And I think Ryan and I are both glad that it's come to the fore, right? As Fred Rogers has come back into our popular culture in these past 3 to 5 years with Morgan Neville's remarkable documentary and the feature film starring Tom Hanks, it's a reminder that he actually brought hard subjects into children's television programming, right? He had tackled death and divorce and assassination and racism, and he brought hard questions into the neighborhood. And Ryan can cite this quotation in our book better than I can, but essentially he didn't allow it to destroy the canvas of that land of make-believe, right? I mean, he brought it in, but didn't allow it to destroy the experience, but said, we're gonna wrestle with hard questions here. And ideally you see elements of that in our book too, because we tried to bring in the world of racism and the pandemic and things that we're facing here in 2021, because ultimately this is not a book about Fred Rogers. This is a book about a blueprint for learning that we want for our kids and for our kids in our schools, our museums and libraries, and in neighborhoods all across America.
Yeah, that quote that Greg was referencing earlier, this Mary Rawson, who's a Pittsburgher, and she's an actress, and she played, for those of you who are familiar with the show, she played Cousin Mary Owl in the neighborhood of Make-Believe. But she wrote that in the neighborhood, violence and war, hatred and intolerance are not painted out of the picture, but neither are they allowed to destroy the canvas. I think it's a well-intentioned impulse to want to shield kids or anyone from hard things, even sometimes to the point of denial. Rogers never did that. He allowed these things to come in, but what he did do was make kids feel safe enough to discuss them, to be shy about them, to even be scared of them. They were allowed to have their feelings about these things, and they knew that no matter what, there was going to be somebody with him or with them to help them talk about it. One of the great pleasures, aside from watching The Neighborhood and writing this book, was visiting the Fred Rogers Archive in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which is about 40 miles outside of Pittsburgh. That's where Rogers grew up. It's where his archives are now at St. Vincent College. And in this archive, there are boxes and boxes and boxes from decades worth of correspondence. In fact, if any of you have written Fred Rogers a letter, it's probably still there. And you can go in here and you can read what kids were saying. Kids, not just kids, adults, lots of adults too, were saying to Rogers. He always said one of the greatest things we can do, one of the best gifts we can give, is listening to people. And it's interesting that that was his philosophy, because of course he was on television. He could talk about listening, but he couldn't actually hear the people on the other side of the camera. To go and read through these letters and to see what people were confiding in him, you know, Mr. Rogers, I'm scared. Mr. Rogers, I'm sick. Mr. Rogers, you know, I don't know what, you know, life has become overwhelming. You can pick up almost any letter and find him talking about that issue in an episode of The Neighborhood. You can draw direct through lines from what people were saying to what he was saying back. It's very much a conversation in a way that I don't think we always think of. You know, television just doesn't lend itself to that. But the first thing he did every morning was come in. There would be a pile of the day's mail, sometimes 50 to 100 letters a day sitting on his desk. And that is what informed, you know, what he was going to write about, what he was going to, you know, put into the program.
I think
if I interject with a personal story. Ryan's heard me tell this a dozen times now, but it speaks to your question too about inviting hard questions. And it's important to note that, you know, while I'm a parent and Ryan is a teacher, like, we're not perfect parents and perfect teachers, right? And these are not Greg and Ryan's blueprints for learning. They're the blueprints of Fred Rogers. So you could imagine how researching this book, writing this book, now having the privilege of talking about this book has challenged us as humans, right? And finding ourselves trying to become better. And I had a moment just about a month ago. It was a Friday night. You all know Friday nights. I was exhausted at the end of the week, and I'd thrown myself on my living room floor next to the sofa because all I wanted to do was flip among 3 NCAA basketball games that were on there. I just wanted 20 minutes of just like, and my older daughter was lying on the sofa behind me, and she had her head on the armrest, and she's just about 10. So she's, beginning to develop her identity, right? And I should tell you that my wife is Taiwanese by background. So my daughter is of mixed race, and she's beginning to appreciate that she has multiple identities. And it was that week that the murders of multiple Asian Americans in Atlanta had happened. Now, maybe to Ryan's earlier comment, like my wife and I protect, like any parents, we try and protect our kids. We don't invite every badness in. We weren't watching the news that week, but inevitably the news of what had happened in Atlanta had gotten into our household here in northern Pittsburgh. And so I'm sitting there watching a basketball game, and I hear in my ear, right? So it's this ear, "Daddy, am I going to be shot?" Right? It came right out of left field, the question. And there are far too many families, parents in this country who've heard a question like that before. There are so many that'll never hear that question. And it was, for me, it was the first time I'd ever heard anything like that in my life. And my heart went cold. And I say that to say, at that moment of that incredibly hard question, it was like the lessons of this book came home to me. In a sense, how do I acknowledge what it is that she just said? How do I notice what she just said? How do I explain to her that it's okay to have these big feelings? How do I help acknowledge that maybe I don't have the answers? How do I help her feel both psychologically and physically safe? I mean, these are the things that Fred Rogers talks about in the most mundane and the most significant of ways of the circumstances and context and conditions that we have to create for kids, as they wonder about these questions. And in this case, it was a really severe question that my daughter had. But I mentioned it to say, it's a personal, maybe a profound example of the lessons of this book coming home, but it speaks to a blueprint for learning of that science of learning to which Ryan spoke earlier.
Wow, that is really profound.
Yeah.
I don't cry about it now. If
Yeah.
I couldn't talk about that a month ago without crying. Now I don't know. It's not that I'm cold about it. It's just.
No, I completely understand.
So my question is, did you turn off the games?
That's a great question. So I actually don't remember. I just remember turning around, right, and talking with her. And it's a great question because I don't know what happened next. I don't remember watching the games. So I must have, I don't know what we did.
But you obviously dealt with it. And like you said, the lessons of what you and Ryan researched and have written about helped you with that situation.
Oh, it came rushing home. It was like everything I'd worked on 3 years. And I don't know how I did, right? But I think I know I did better because of what I'd learned.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, can I just say, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Dawn. I go to church with Pat at Conshohocken United Methodist. I'm so happy to be here. And that first question was my question.
Oh, thank you.
I am a huge Mr. Rogers fan. I'm from Ohio, though, but close enough to your area. But I grew up with him. It was always Mr. Rogers, Electric Company, and Sesame Street. But I would just I remember Mr. Rogers because, and then the whole Saturday Night Live thing, of course, later came off. But what to me about Mr. Rogers, like you were talking about the conversation, I felt as a little girl watching Mr. Rogers that he did have a conversation with me. Yeah. And if you guys have done all the research, remember how he would come in and he'd talk right to the camera, which was unheard of before. He'd say, "Hi, neighbor." And he would talk right to you. And I literally would go, "Hi, Mr. Rogers." Like I did have a conversation with him. And remember how he would speak so slowly? He spoke very slow, but it was because I think to relate to, not to talk down to children, but as children, there's so many things that you're like multitasking and you want to do, but I was just so tuned into him and I felt he was talking to me. And he also allowed me to have time to think. Because if you think about it today, the shows, kids shows, there's like so much going on. There's a lot of noise and now kids are on the computer. They're doing too many things at once. But I remember just thinking, Mr. Rogers' time, and I'm just going to be with Mr. Rogers. Like, I didn't want to do anything else because I was having that time with him. And it was just me and Mr. Rogers. Sometimes my mom would come with me, but that was like, he was so a role model to me.
There, that sense of quiet and giving kids time to think was so integral to what he was trying to do.
Yeah.
There are lots of examples, if anyone saw the documentary, they show the scene where he turns an egg timer on and he says, "Do you want to see what a minute is like?" And then he just lets the clock go for a full minute.
Yeah.
There are so many more that we noticed when we were, researching this. There are scenes of Mr. Rogers sitting there and literally watching paint dry, and he's got a little smile on his face, and he's happy. It was there was some internal debate in the neighborhood as to whether or not he should give you that sort of time to respond, knowing that when he asked a question, kids at home were likely saying things out loud. It was a hard call because Rogers wanted to give kids space to process and to think and to respond, but he also never wanted to lie to them or to falsely allow children to believe that he could hear them through the camera. I think ultimately he struck a happy medium of making sure that he didn't rush kids along, but also making sure that he was always very explicit about what is make-believe and what is real.
Right. Yeah, it was definitely when he was going to make believe, it was completely, it was like a different set. There wasn't, you knew what was real and you knew when he was going to make believe with the trolley.
It was so deliberate. So Don, in the book, if you had a chance to read it, and we try and give you all sorts of examples in 2021 of people, of schools, of places of learning that are essentially using that Fred method. And one of the teachers whom we cite is Melissa Butler.
Okay.
And what you described, she describes in 3 words: noticing, wondering, and struggling. Right. So she, in her kindergarten classroom for nearly 2 decades, very much approached that classroom the way Fred Rogers approached his show. There's that frenetic energy, the kids rushing into the classroom, the music slows down, she slows down the kids, she gets them situated, makes sure that they feel like they belong in her classroom, that they're there. It's very individualized, personalized. She connected with each child as that each child came into her kindergarten classroom. It was very Fred-like. And then, as they're working on literacy and numeracy, she also created space for wondering. And she would pull out toys or things as simple as buttons and just have the kids look. Imagine having 25 kindergarten kids holding a button and just noticing it and just sitting there for a few minutes. Like, what do you notice about this button? And it's probably painful at first. It's probably painful for the kids, but then they start to say like, oh, well, there are 3 buttons on this. Oh, well, this one has scratches. Well, this one's black and this one's larger. And they start to notice things. And then they start wondering, like, well, what could you do with this thing? And then she creates settings and activities just as Fred did, like, what could we make with this? What would we invent with this? What could we make believe about this? And I just love that sensibility of creating space in both physical space and time, of helping kids notice, wonder, and then struggle.
John, just one more note on the slowness thing, just because I thought of it. So there is a measurable difference between Mr. Rogers and almost any other TV show. So as of 2007, the average children's TV show cut. The camera would switch between every 2.5 seconds, and it was speeding up over time. Rogers allowed no more than 2 cuts per minute in the episode. So the result is a much slower paced program. Again, deliberate.
Fascinating. Thank you.
I really like how you guys extrapolated from, what happened with Mr. Rogers' program and how he really gave children time to slow down and to think and to and talked about how important it is that we remember that lesson today. It just feels like today's kids are they don't get that opportunity to slow down and think, and they don't let their, I don't want to say brains empty, but there's so many things that are calling upon our attention between, the internet and phones and television, and there's always something you could be doing. And I think that, giving kids time to slow down and actually think and think about what they want to do is one of the lessons that you guys talk about that really came home to me.
Yeah.
The other
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Now, it kind of related to that, I was a line in the book, I'm not finished it, but the fact that curiosity can be caught and taught, and that it's not just for little kids. When I was a teacher, I taught middle school science, and kids were always very excited about science, etc. But some of your research showed that curiosity, creativity drops off, and I found it very positive what you said in the book about the fact that it's not gone, it's there. You can ignite it again.
Yeah, you're not doomed to it. It's not necessarily a natural thing. It's all learned behavior. One of Roger's favorite quotes was a Quaker saying, which he got from his mentor, Margaret McFarland, that attitudes are caught, not taught. I think that drop off in curiosity and creativity certainly does come from adults, and for adults, it came from the adults before them. It is really, really hard to find time to just sit and wonder about things now. We could all go day in and day out with just constant stimulation between emails and social media, and there are a million things to read, there are a million things to do. It's interesting that there's a statistic in the book that I think 85% of people say that they have their best ideas in the shower, because that is, unless you're asleep, it's the last place that you're not doing anything but just being present with yourself, So I think the more we can do that as adults, the more we can allow ourselves to wonder about things that interest us, the more we can allow us to waste time is the wrong phrase, but just do things that don't necessarily have an end. Melissa Butler, the educator who Greg mentioned earlier, she says that learning is keeping yourself in a perpetual state of not knowing. And with so much information so easily accessible now, it's hard to not know things sometimes. We can find out the answer to just about anything.
Yeah.
So the more we can give ourselves space and time to do that, I think the better off we'll all be.
And it's partly why we wanted to convey as many sort of concrete examples of things that we as adults might do. And turning to a school setting as an example, the schools that are creating period X or genius hours, and how principals and administrators are building that into a bell schedule while still also attending to the things that they feel they need to attend to. Or we give the example of Hedda Sherpin, who worked with Fred Rogers for 40 years and gives us an example of walking into a classroom and noticing that a teacher had something called an Ask It basket. Now, if I recall correctly, this teacher was in a lower grade, but it could be in a middle school, or it could even be in a high school, right? But just having an Ask It basket, so when that student asks that question that's maybe on point or maybe comes from right over the left field wall, not rushing to answer that question, saying like, oh, that's an interesting question, finding reason to write it down, acknowledging and noticing the question, and saying, we're going to wonder about that later together. And then giving the space for that to happen at some point. There are tactical things that we as adults can do in simple ways, iterative ways, to begin to create settings that are more conducive to Fred Rogers' blueprints on the way to wholesale changes, right?
Right. That example really jumped out at me in the book, mainly because I've worked in schools, and I know that sometimes teachers are on schedules and they have to get things done, and yet that was a way to acknowledge the child, so that the student felt like his or her concerns or questions were being considered by the teacher, and yet still being able to move the class forward. And, maybe she'll get back to that question when she can. And I thought that was a really great tool.
There's a moment in the book when a researcher, Susan Engel, who's one of the most foremost experts on how curiosity develops in kids, and she did this long ethnography where she would go in schools and she would just sit and observe for hours at a time. She did this for months. She did this for years. And what she realized was that in most classrooms, even in some of the most lively classrooms, kids were asking questions about things that interest them maybe once an hour, on average twice an hour. There was even a moment when she saw, a student raised her hand and said, "Are there any places in the world where nobody makes art?" Which is like a fascinating and weird and worthwhile question. And the teacher said, "No questions right now. It's time for learning." Now, I understand, having been a teacher.
It is learning.
But I understand, having been in the classroom,
right,
the pressures you're under. And that's not a standard handed down to you by the state. That's not on the test, which is how you are evaluated as a professional. But if we wonder why so many kids don't like school, I think that's a big part of the answer.
Plus, think about that student. Do you think that student's going to be apt to ask any more questions? If that teacher's like, "Well, we need to learn right now." I mean, I still remember teachers in my elementary school. I mean, I had some great ones, but I remember one time a teacher, how you're taught so many times a question's never a bad, like there's no stupid questions, right?
Absolutely.
I remember one time a teacher telling me, "That is a stupid question, Dawn." And I was like, "But I thought there were no stupid questions." She's like, "Well, that one was." That was in fifth grade.
I think that was a big part. We talked about the mail earlier. That's a big part of the reason why, it was policy at the neighborhood offices that everybody got a response. And there are some very moving questions in the Fred Rogers Archive. And there are some questions that I could not tell you what they were actually talking about, but everybody got a response. Everybody was acknowledged. Everybody was made to feel valued. Everybody was shown that they matter in some way to this person who meant so much to them.
Wow. It's amazing.
Another thing in the book that not to jump forward, but the way that you guys talk, that was really dealing with curiosity. And the other two sections of your book deal with creativity and caring. And I don't want to give them short shrift. I just thought that the creativity part really was very important. There was one line that you had that really struck me. You said, "Adults who do something creative at least once a day have been found to be happier and healthier." And I think there was a lot in this book that not only was aimed at helping us deal with our kids or deal with kids that we work with in our jobs every day, but also reminding us that we could do something to make ourselves better, that there's ways for us to be better there.
Yeah, I think we both have personal examples of that. Greg, do you want to talk about your skateboarding adventures?
So I don't know if you all noticed, I just exited Zoom and came right back in. We're having storms where I am, so I lost the last minute. So
let me get you back.
I'm back now, but Ryan, so I missed the question, so set me up.
Sure. So she was asking about the importance of, this is a book about, Rogers lessons for children, but it also has lots of lessons for adults. And one of the things that Sydney mentioned was this statistic of adults who do something creative at least once a day have been found to be happier and healthier. And I think both Greg and I have adjusted our routines or maybe expanded our interests a little bit as a result of doing this book.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we think about, Don, I think of your comment just a moment ago of how the teacher responded. And it goes to the actually well-researched learning science about, do kids feel like they belong? Do they feel like respected? Do they feel like they're physically safe? And Pat, to your earlier comment about attitudes are caught, well, interests are also caught, right? And kids notice the things that drive our passions and interests as grown-ups. And so early in the pandemic, I don't know what I was doing. I went out into my garage. You'd be embarrassed to see my garage in the pandemic. It's a bit like Hoarders. But I found my old skateboard, right? And I used to love to skateboard. I was actually pretty good. And so I pulled out my old Madrid skateboard and I just started skating down the street. And there's a bit of an incline on my lane. And it was, it was the sort of thing I was laughing hysterically. It just felt joyful because all those emotions and happiness of something that interested me came back. And all the kids were outside. It was a beautiful day and they noticed me doing it. So immediately my older daughter says like, I want to try that. And then one after another. Well, fast forward to today and 8 girls on our street all are skateboarders now. Which I think it's a good thing. I don't know how the rest of you feel, but the point being, right, whether it's in the kitchen, in our garages, in our maker spaces, playing our guitar, kids noticing, if you're into beekeeping or you're into baseball statistics or you pull out your skateboard, that joyful learning. It's about creating a joyful learning environment because those attitudes are caught. And in this case, a bunch of girls were caught on to my joy of skateboarding.
That's great. And you survived, no injury.
I know, and actually the girls yelled at me because I went down without a helmet, which I know is bad, but it was, I now wear a helmet. I skateboard with them now too, it's so fun.
That's great.
I'm glad you brought up about the pandemic because as I was reading the book, I was getting kind of anxious when it was talking about the fact that creativity across the board has really been measurably dropping. And then I started thinking about, well, during the pandemic, the things that are making that as supposed to be making the creativity drop, like the overscheduling, the, always following a structured team, etc. What do you think about, creativity now?
So Pat, I think it's going to be so interesting years from now. At some point, researchers will look back at this time period. And to be sure, there's a lot of trauma and a lot of stress and a lot of dark spots. So I don't want to minimize those. But I also think there are going to be some remarkable bright spots. It's unfortunate, I think, that so many, not educators, but people writing about education tend to talk right now about learning loss. And yes, maybe according to the types of things that we have been measuring over the past few decades, there is learning loss. But I think we suspect that there's been all sorts of learning that's been happening that we're not capturing, that's not measured, for which the world doesn't have assessments. And maybe, just maybe, this is the beginning of a renaissance of learning. And I'll tell you, because I think most of us are in Pennsylvania, maybe a few not in Pennsylvania, but just this week, I spent a number of hours with the Pennsylvania Department of Education, because through some work I co-lead through a network called Remake Learning. We've convened people all across the state of Pennsylvania. There were 200 administrators, more than 1,000 people participate in surveys to really design what is the future of learning and education that we want in Pennsylvania, and what are the regulations, what is the budgeting, things that we want on the other side of this pandemic. And for me, the really hopeful thing is it's this renaissance of learning. It's a lot more like Fred Rogers blueprints than it was what we had the past 20 years. And so I have a lot of hope about what's possible on the other side of this pandemic.
Pat, there's a great moment in the book where we're talking to Dr. Valerie Kinloch, who is she's the co-chair of Remake Learning, who Greg just mentioned, but she is also the dean of the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. And Dr. Kinloch was talking about, how she fell in love with learning as a girl growing up in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm just going to read you her quote because I can't improve on it. She said, "What her teachers helped her see is that the people around her were, quote, a series of books that I hadn't been reading. Everything my teachers were trying to teach me was always right in front of me. I didn't have to open a book to read it. I could just sit and listen to the conversations happening on the front porches or at the kitchen table or in the hallways at school. And when I realized that, that's when I fell deeply in love with learning." I love that quote. And I especially love that Dr. Kinloch is the head of a school of education. You know, Greg mentioned that there is so much possibility on the other side of this. I think the fact that someone who is in charge of training thousands of teachers every year is valuing different kinds of learning, maybe that hadn't been necessarily prioritized over the past few years, is really, really promising. And it speaks, as Greg said, to Rogers' blueprint. You know, Rogers was not a classroom teacher, but I do think he was one of the best educators, you know, to ever walk the planet, because he considered learning something that happens everywhere all the time. That's why it was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, not Mr. Rogers' classroom.
Can I ask, do you guys have a favorite chapter or section in your book?
Yeah, well, I don't like to play favorites. I will say that this book at the beginning was rejected several times. We had lots of great help, but it didn't begin as what it became. There was a lot of work at the front end and a lot of tweaking of the formula. So I have a special affinity for chapter 1, because when that chapter was finished, we had a blueprint. We had a formula. It was like finding a life raft in the middle of the ocean. You know, we had our way forward. We knew we could create a book. So I like chapter 1, which is about curiosity for that, but my favorite chapter is the final chapter, which is about connection and the importance of community and of being in relationship with people. I don't know that that would have been my favorite chapter before COVID, but I also don't know that we would have written the chapter in the same way had the pandemic not happened. You know, the past year has been a case study in what happens when we're cut off from other people. And I think we all knew intuitively that being around others was important, but to learn the science of just how critical it is to feel a sense of belonging, to know that you matter to other people, to a community. You know, the past year has driven that home in ways that I could never imagine when we started this book.
So I tease my co-author here that he's now on my favorites listing among my phone numbers. He's broken through because it's only my wife and my family, and now Ryan. And I mentioned that to say, surprise, surprise, I have the same answer. I think chapter 6, such a good feeling about connection, precisely because of what Ryan described. I mean, writing this and framing it out and talking about it and trying to identify the concrete things with which we can close the chapter, because we try and close each chapter with examples of practical tips somewhere in the world, not our own, but really curating others. And writing this at a time, the pandemic was rising, something terrible. George Floyd had just been murdered. It was a hard time, and to be writing about connection, I think in the end, it might be the most powerful chapter in the book.
I really, you mentioned how you have tips at the end of each chapter, and I appreciated that. You know, the meat of the chapter is all these wonderful examples of how, you know, educators that you speak to or scientists that you speak to, and how they represent or how they implement these basic principles or ideas that Mr. Rogers also used. And then to be able to say, well, this is how you can as a parent or as a teacher. And I actually plan to hand this book on to my daughter, who is going to be a music education teacher. So I think it's helpful, because a lot of these things are possibly instinctual. Some of the things you might think that it feels right, but to see the examples of why it really works and why it's you know, what you're actually accomplishing by using some of these tools is very helpful.
We are extremely fortunate to have so many of Rogers' real life colleagues still with us in Pittsburgh. And they were champions of this project from the very beginning. They helped us through every chapter. In fact, one of them, Hedda Sharapin, who Greg mentioned earlier, you know, volunteered to read the entire manuscript, and she found some things, she fixed some things, she helped us clarify some things. All the people who worked with Fred Rogers are just as generous and brilliant and kind as he was. So the fact that we wrote this book now I'm just so happy we did it, you know, because we mentioned this earlier. we have Joanne Rogers, who wrote the foreword, and she passed away before the book was able to come out. So it's an honor to, I think, for us to have been able to capture some of these lessons while we still can.
How did you get her to become involved in the book?
Well, as Ryan noted, we've had the joy over years of working with not only Hedda, but Bill Eisler, who led Fred Rogers Productions for decades, with Roberta Schomburg, who's the current director at the Fred Rogers Center. And so it was working with them that we came to know Joanne over the years. And in fact, a number of years ago, my wife and I were asked to chair the gala event for the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. When they host that, they present the Good Neighbor Award. And they wanted to present that year's award to Joanne Rogers. Because she was a children's advocate in her own right? Like, she deserved to be honored and recognized that way. And in the last chapter of her life, she was a remarkable steward of Fred's legacy. And so it was particularly during that year, which was about maybe 5-6 years ago, that I got to know her personally well. So just as Ryan and I were starting this project, we gave Joanne a call. You sort of want her blessing, right?
Yeah.
You want, like, if nothing else, I didn't want her to be surprised that we were writing this book, a book about learning, but grounded in Fred Rogers and his sensibility about learning. And she was a champion from day one, and had a chance periodically to, to connect with her and have the blessing of her writing this foreword that's in her book. And in fact, that week that she passed, just maybe 2 or 3 days before she passed, she and I were emailing, and then we lost her.
If anyone else wants to chime in with any questions, please do not be shy. I think we have a small enough group that you can certainly unmute yourself and jump in, or if you wanted to raise your hand and do it that way, you can. I don't need to be the only one speaking. It's okay. There was I have a lot of things highlighted in this book, but one thing that you talk about later on in the book is the diversity of representation of different kinds of kids on television. And I also, diverse books I'm sure diversity in books is a huge issue for libraries. We always want to try and bring books in that show different kinds of kids so that people can, kids can see themselves in books. And so that really jumped out for me too. Do you see improvements in diversity and representation?
I think it's hard for us probably to say. I don't know if Greg and I are in a position to say yes or no. I think one of the people we interview in the book is Dr. Aisha White, who worked with Fred Rogers for a number of years, helping translate the lessons of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for classrooms. Today she runs, it's called the PRIDE program at the University of Pittsburgh. It's Positive Racial Identity Development and Early Education. So her whole job is to find ways to help Black kids specifically, find ways to feel good about themselves, because they don't get the society doesn't send them a lot of positive messages. It was so enlightening and illuminating for us to talk to her, at least for me, because this is something that at least I never had to think about when I grew up. When I watched TV, everybody looked like me for the most part. I got it. I never felt, it was easy for me to feel connected. And it was interesting to hear Aisha's perspective, because Fred Rogers was in many ways on the forefront of trying to bring more diversity to children's television specifically. There was a study done in, I think it was the 1980s, where they analyzed, I think it was 1,100 TV characters from children's television, all the programs that were on in a given year. And I think of that 1,100, there were 84 who weren't white and maybe 40 were Black. That is a shocking ratio to me. I mean, it's not something I ever would have thought of as a kid, but Rogers was very intentional about who he was casting and how he was casting them. So Mayor Maggie of Westwood is a Black woman. She's a Black woman in a position of power introduced in the neighborhood in the 1970s. That, again, in Rogers' very understated way, was revolutionary for children's television. A lot has been made about the scene where Rogers invites Officer Francois Clemens, who is a Black man, he's a gay man, he's a police officer. Rogers invites him to come cool his feet off in a swimming pool. Of course, that was symbolic of so much of the racial strife that was going on at the time, where pools were ground zero for this. Rogers was very intentional about this, and yet he did it in a quiet, approachable way in which I think made people feel safe. And I think that's why people are still a big reason why Rogers' audience is so diverse today, and why people of every race, every creed, every background feel so connected to him.
And I'll just add two things. One, as you've commented in the book, we try and elucidate learning science and make it very plain for us to understand, but for the rest of the world to understand too. And I mean, we have good data, we have good research that more diverse teams in collaborative work settings produce better outcomes. So there's also just the data, if we want to be completely self-interested to reaching better outcomes, that more diverse teams and the more diverse intersectional thinking actually leads to better outcomes. To your question, Sydney, I would also say, Ryan and I have the privilege of working on behalf of the Grable Foundation, which is a private charitable foundation. And I would say, again, this is anecdotal, and we're an N of 2. But the attention, particularly among white leaders, white superintendents, non-white leaders in positions, and really attending to what does it mean to be an anti-racist organization, seems to be more at the fore. And the cynical side of me, and I don't have many cynical side of me, but the cynical side of me said that those types of questions and that attention would pass after last summer. And I would say happily they haven't. People are really wrestling with leadership questions of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. So I'm hopeful about that.
I will just add one more thing. So Rogers, he didn't just make Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood the TV show. His nonprofit Family Communications put out a lot of educational books. They put out music. They put out a lot of additional stuff, all for the purpose of helping children learn. It was all very non-commercial. But he used to have to fight with his publishers to use the photographs that he wanted to use on his books. When there was a series called, My First Time. It was for kids who were going to the doctor for the first time, maybe going on an airplane, things that could be scary. He was so intentional about who was on the cover of that. When there was a doctor, he had a Black doctor. When there was a airplane, it was a male flight attendant. He was conscious of showing children that they don't have to accept views of themselves based on what they look like or where they come from.
Right.
And in order to do that, you have to be intentional. And that's exactly what Rogers did, even when it wasn't easy.
Well, I think it's not only the fact that, Black children can see themselves in these roles. I think it's also important for all of us to see a Black person in those roles. And I really appreciated that discussion. I thought that was really good.
Yeah.
There's a study in the book that talks about the importance of media representation for all races, because when you see a person of a certain race stereotyped again and again and again on a television show, whether it's as stereotyped as a criminal or as a terrorist, the more you see these images, even if they're fictional, they can become, their brain starts to treat them as memories. And that can intrude on reality. That can happen to an adult, and it can certainly happen with kids.
Yep.
Does anyone have any questions for our authors? You guys have been making some really nice comments in the chat, but Kathy, do you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to say, number one, I was way too cool for Mr. Rogers when he debuted. I was 12 or 13, and that's. But I got to know Mr. Rogers when I became a mother, and my oldest son. I used to sit and watch the show with him, and I was amazed. I thought, oh, let me read something, while he wants me to sit with him. And I just got involved in the show, and I was transported by, I thought this guy is so good. I was used to the Eddie Murphy, things on Saturday Night Live. And I thought, this man is amazing. And my son told me later that when he went to Penn State, he's at main campus, and Fred Rogers came to speak. He said, Mom, he said, the room, you couldn't
Yeah.
fit the person, it was packed. He said, and big, tough guys, in tears,
Oh,
crying and telling Rogers how much it meant to them. And I then watched the movie that was just out a few years ago. I love Matthew Rice, who, played the, and I was just wondering how accurate and true was. There was so much in that movie that it put me in tears. The scene on the subway,
Yeah.
I sobbed. I cried. I will admit to it.
I
I haven't read your book yet, but it's ordered. It's coming in Amazon because I want my daughter, she's a new mother, to read it.
Good.
The
But was
subway
the
scene-
movie, was that? Yeah,
Oh,
it
but-
was true.
Yeah, so the movie is based on a 1998 article in Esquire by a journalist named Tom Janot. Matthew Rice, he's playing the journalist.
Right.
It is worth, if you haven't read that article, I think, in my personal opinion, it's the best magazine feature ever written. I'm willing to say that. But he does mention in that article the scene on the subway. If you all haven't seen the movie, it's this scene where Rogers is in New York. I think he's in maybe Harlem. He's surrounded by all sorts of kids, and they all simultaneously burst into singing Won't You Be My Neighbor.
Uh-huh.
And it's an extremely moving scene, and yeah, that does come from real life, at least according to Mr. Janot.
And Kathy, let me just recommend to you. So we were lucky that Tom Hanks endorsed this book, and so too did Morgan Neville. So have you seen Morgan Neville's documentary?
Yes.
So as much as I enjoyed the movie, I think the documentary is brilliant.
It is.
And the last 10 minutes, my throat just constricts. It's just hard because like I was on the other side because I would watch the show with my mom, and I made the mistake of taking my mom with me to go see that documentary. And we were sitting in a movie theater in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, and we're both just crying.
Right.
All of those, it all comes back, right? It all comes back.
Yeah, I was totally moved, but I have to let you know that the big guys up at Penn State were reduced to tears.
I love it.
Because it just came back, and a lot of them said, because Chris was talking to some, he was like on the newspaper up there, and they said, I just felt safe again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think he
in
was
this
also,
crazy world.
he was a surrogate, maybe a father figure, a grandfather to some. I think he just kind of got into your world. I mean, he did with me. I mean, it's not that I had a mother and I had a father, but he just became like just a friend.
I think
It sounds strange to say that, but
No, but think of the great teachers in your life.
Yeah,
The
true.
great librarians in life. They all have that same sensibility, and it's because they respected childhood. They respected who you were. They respected your questions. They made you feel safe.
Yeah.
Kathy, to your point about those big guys up at Penn State, they made you feel safe. They made you feel like you belonged. And that's what he did so brilliantly, because then you can start to be creative and curious and wonder.
One of the things you mentioned in the book is you have a teacher who kind of implements the lessons here by greeting the students every day at his school and as they come in. And we actually, the principal at my kids' school who just started a few years ago after they were just about ready to graduate, he stands out there and he welcomes everyone to school every day. And I guess I'm understanding where he got that idea. And I do think that something like that, it makes people feel safe, kind of the way that Mr. Rogers would welcome everyone in the neighborhood.
And I know we're running out of time, so I'll make this quick, but on this idea of of the safety and comfort that Rogers provided. I'm not surprised to hear that the big tough guys at Penn State went to pieces over that, because that's a very deeply human emotion. There's this study in the book. It's extraordinarily cruel and it would never happen today. But a psychologist named Harry Harlow separated baby monkeys from their mothers from birth, just to see what would happen. What would happen to a baby monkey if you grew up without any adult monkey figure in your life? So he put them in cages, and one cage got a fake monkey that was made out of wire, but there was food inside. So this surrogate parent, as I think, Dawn, you used that term,
Right.
this surrogate parent dispensed food, but was made out of wire and very uncomfortable. There was another surrogate in the cage that was made out of cloth, but did not dispense food. The monkeys universally spent all of their time with the monkey that was made out of cloth. They would go to the other one for food, but they chose comfort and warmth and safety over their basic needs. If that doesn't, tell you what basic needs really are, then I don't know what does.
Yeah, true. Touche.
True.
Well, I think we all got a lot of interesting ideas tonight. Thank you so much for talking about your book. I certainly enjoyed it. I hope it does really well. I'm so glad that you sold the book and you were able to get somebody to greenlight it for you. And it's really well written. It's a wonderful.
And it
wonderful
makes
book.
a great Mother's Day gift.
And it makes a
Tell
great
your
Mother's
friend.
Day gift.
I just
That's what
ordered
my
it
mom's
on
getting.
Amazon for my daughter.
Or a graduation gift for a teacher who's graduating from
Yes.
college, or there's lots of great ideas here.
Well,
Does
we
anyone have
appreciate
any?
that. We learned last week, so the book had been released a week and it went to a second print, which we feel
Wow.
like, it has some early legs. So yes,
Good.
buy it for your moms, buy it for your teachers.
And
Yeah.
please
It's National
review
Teachers
it on
Day.
Amazon. I see Ellen Davis here. You left us a super kind review on Amazon today. Thank you so
Oh
much.
yeah,
It
that's
just
good.
means
We'll
the
do
world.
that. We'll do that.
Thank you.
If
I
anybody
think
has
it's
any
National
last
Appreciation
questions,
Teachers Day, right?
Yeah, today,
Yeah.
all week long, or
Yeah, all
like
week
the
long,
rest
yeah.
of the month.
I just wanted to say thank you for your work in education, not just for the book, but continuing to use that education. I think so much teachers, I think, are drawn to the profession because of a lot of the things that you guys wrote about and talk about and what Fred Rogers was about. But I think I feel like from my experience as a teacher, we've gone in a different direction and these things somehow just disappeared, and teachers want them, but they don't feel like they can have them in their classroom because there's no time. So, hearing you guys, what you're involved with, at least in Pennsylvania, I just think is incredible. And, it's clear from the science that these things need to be in schools. They need to be part of kids' lives. It's just so important. So appreciate that work that you're doing too.
Thank you.
Yeah,
yeah, I don't think we emphasized enough in the book. You're talking about it's not just a reminiscence about a great educator and who, Mr. Rogers was. It's really to help us try and raise kids to be great adults, to be what our society really needs them to be. And I think that it was very informative about that.
Thank you. We mentioned Joanne Rogers and that she used the phrasing of these are Fred Rogers blueprints,
Mhm.
right? And surprise, those blueprints might be 50 years old, but they are incredibly relevant in 2021 and into the future. And the question, as Emily, you were just noting, is how do we harness those? How do we really use them? Fred Rogers was ahead of his time. Let's make it his time now.
Extremely timely information, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
all so much for being here and your great questions. It really means a lot.
Yeah, this was completely fun.
Yeah.
I didn't know we were ending. Go all night.
Very much.
Thank you both very much. And thank you, Pat, for bringing these authors and this book to our attention. And
Also,
Quite
can I just recognize my parents real quick? Thank you for being here.
Oh yeah.
welcome.
All
Here,
recognize your parents.
Wait, I haven't met Mr. and Mrs. Ryan. Wait, where?
They're right at Trudy. It's Trudy.
Oh, I
We
feel
have-
so, this is super special now for me.
Hey, thank you, Pat, for doing this.
Yes.
Oh, you're welcome. And I got the idea from you.
Oh,
It's really cool. We have somebody at the shore is here tonight. We've got people from Pittsburgh. We've got Conshohocken, and it's really great that we could all get together and talk like this. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
hey, Papa.
Thank